program at the American University. Oh, hi, I'm Janaki Lennon. I'm a writer of nonfiction books on Indian wildlife. I'm in conversation with Stephen Alter, who was born in Mussoorie, Uttarakhand, and the Himalayan region features in almost all his work. His honors include a Guggenheim Fellowship and a Fulbright Award. He directed a writing program at the American University in Cairo and was writer in residence at MIT for 10 years. He's written 13 books of fiction and 7 books of nonfiction. This book we're going to talk about today is his 21st book. In an earlier era, we'd have a guest to give the first copy to and an audience to applaud. So in this new world, I'll be the audience. Congratulations, Steve.
Thank you, Janaki. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Crossword, for this platform to talk about books and authors. And thank you, Steve, for joining me. So the book is called Feral Dreams, Mowgli and His Mothers, published by Aleph Book Company. And I wanted to start off by asking you, Steve. I know the answer, but I wanted to ask you anyway in the hopes the answer would change, and also because you're so prolific. Does writing get easier with time?
Well, I'll answer that in a moment, but my thanks to Crossword as well for hosting this program, and my special thanks to you, Janaki, for being willing to compere this conversation. Thanks. Does writing get any easier over time? No, I don't think so. I remember when I published my first novel way back in 1978, and I thought to myself, well, now I'm a writer. Now it's all downhill from here. And I never realized that, in fact, with every book, it becomes just a little bit harder, not only to write, but to sell the book, to persuade a publisher that what you've written is something worthwhile, and then to try and lure an audience of readers to your work. So no, it gets harder as it goes. I thought, for instance, I mean, the first few books I wrote were all written on a manual typewriter, and when word processing began, I thought to myself, well, this is going to be easy. I'm going to write 2 books in the space of time it took me to write one, and it didn't. It's a slow process, and it doesn't matter if you can cut and paste on your computer. You still need the time to be able to finish a book properly and completely.
Well, I was hoping you would say it would get easier. Okay, I have to say, I really, really love this book. I love the way you blurred myth and reality. Okay, fictional reality, because it is a novel. And there's a story within a story, and there are the characters, the Miss Sahib, Daniel, Mowgli, Yusuf Daku, and of course the animals. And I also love the complicated relationship between Miss Cranston and Daniel, because he refuses to be rescued, right? He's not someone you would expect him to feel grateful to his savior, but he doesn't do that, and it makes it more complicated. So long after I finished reading the book, I was still trying to connect different things to everything, and I was just amazed by how tightly you had structured it and how the connections are all subtle, and it leaves the reader to think about it and make those connections long after they finish reading. So I really, really enjoyed that book. So let me start by asking you, Steve, to give us a little bit of your history and your attachment to India.
Sure. Well, I was born in India. I was born in Mussoorie, as you mentioned, and my grandparents actually came to India first in 1916 as American missionaries. And then my father was born here in India, and my parents, my mother was born in the United States, but she then came and joined my father and was married here. And they lived for most of their adult lives in Mussoorie or nearby. So India is very much home for us, not just for me individually, but for our family, and we still maintain ties in the United States. Our children live there, but I still feel when I come back to Missouri that this is where I belong and this is where I should be.
So, why the title Feral Dreams?
Well, it's interesting. I when I started writing this book, I thought to myself that I would write a children's book. I've written other children's books before, and I thought to myself, let me take the Jungle Story and cast it as a an updated version, primarily for younger readers. But the interesting thing was that as I started writing it, I began to realize that there were a number of themes and ideas that really would appeal as much to a mature audience, an older audience. And the whole idea of a human being feral uh, is something that it's an intriguing idea. It's a fascinating idea. It's a disturbing and a worrying idea. And perhaps it's not the sort of idea that I would inflict on younger readers alone. Uh, and the more I played with that idea of someone who is, in a sense, closer to other species rather than his own, there was a sort of dreamlike quality. Because dreams, I think, are obviously a part of our subconscious, but there's a certain amount of our desires get expressed in those dreams. And I think for me, certainly, the idea that um, a human being could perhaps inhabit a wild place with other creatures is for me a kind of a fantasy or a dream in many ways. And so I think the title came out of that predominantly.
What did Jungle Book mean to you? Did you read it as a kid? How old were you?
Well, I think the first experience I had with Jungle Book was my parents reading parts of the Jungle Books. The Jungle Books themselves are two volumes of stories that Kipling put together. The one is predominantly the Mowgli stories, but then the other one has stories like Rikki Tikki Tavi and some of those other stories about wildlife as well. And I remember my parents reading episodes from the Mowgli stories, as well as, Rikki Tikki Tavi, I think, is the one that sticks in my memory most clearly. And then as I began to read myself, I went back to those stories and looked at those episodes again. And it was interesting. I found, I was talking about there was a darker side to this story than I imagined there would be to begin with. But I found that reading it as a child, there were parts of it that frightened me. There were parts of it that disturbed me. I mean, we're all so used to the Disney version of the Jungle Book, and that, in a sense, sanitized and caricatured a lot of the things that Kipling had put into his book. Kipling himself obviously caricatured a lot of things too, and there are elements of the stories that are a little bit puzzling, particularly in our contemporary age. But my experience of the Jungle Book was very much a sort of early childhood, and then as I got into my teens, reading it myself, and then I happened to be in the United States in 1967 when Walt Disney's Jungle Book came out, and I still remember standing in line with my parents, waiting to get into a theater that summer, and seeing the Jungle Book and being absolutely fascinated by the world that Disney had created there. And the music, of course, is very exciting and appealing. But there was a part of me, as I was watching it, that was saying, this isn't right. This isn't the jungle that I know in India. The trees didn't look right. So many other things were a little bit off. And so when I was writing this, Feral Dreams, I thought to myself, let me also play off those images that I remember from Jungle Book, the film, and try to bring it a little bit closer so that, I try to get the species of trees right. I try to get the bird calls right, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. But you have just come out with, I mean, you wrote In the Jungles of the Night, where you were inspired by Jim Corbett, and now you have been inspired by Jungle Book. So is this something you would like to do more of, to revisit classics and reimagine them for the modern world?
Yeah, well, let me put it this way. For many years, I thought of myself purely as a fiction writer, using India as my primary uh, location and setting and all of that sort of thing. But perhaps in the last 10, 15 years, I began to think of myself more as a nature writer. And you're a nature writer, you'll understand this in the sense that the material that I draw on is the natural history of the Himalaya, also parts of India that I've been uh, familiar with. I visited, of course, a lot of wildlife sanctuaries, national parks, and things like that. And so all of that is very much a part of my imagination. And as I began to define myself more and more as a nature writer, I realized that it didn't just have to be nonfiction, and that fiction also can be a form of nature writing. As a genre, nature writing can spill into fiction. So when I started to look for things in fiction that I could um, uh, write about, stories that I could try to tell, automatically I went back to those stories that had influenced me, had inspired me in earlier days. The Corbett stories are as important to me in terms of my imagination of the Indian forest as the Jungle Book is. So I started with Corbett simply because that caught my imagination first. I don't know where I would go. I mean, I suppose I don't think I could do a uh, fictionalization of M. Krishnan's book or something like that. I think it'd be fascinating to try, but I don't think I'd be able to. So I'm not quite sure what I have left in terms of stories from my childhood that I would be able to recycle in a contemporary setting, or in a revisited setting in that way.
Hmm. So, what is it about feral children that has um, intrigued us? Like the world over, there are so many characters. We have our Mowgli, there's Romulus and Remus, and there's Tarzan. There's so many characters that have come out, from a long time ago and from more modern era. So, what is it about the idea that seems to captivate us so much?
Well, I think, yeah, it's an interesting question, and I think it's a really important question because I think it's one of those primal myths. As I think about it, I mean, what I like to call the first story ever told, which is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which comes from Mesopotamia and what is now referred to as the Middle East. There's a character in there called Enkidu, and Enkidu is this man who lives with the animals. He runs with the animals. Doesn't live in the company of man. And then Gilgamesh, who's the hero of that epic, lures him into civilization, and he is, in a sense, tamed and becomes Gilgamesh's great friend and companion. And so it's right there in the first story, from 300, 400, 500 BC, whenever it came. And it comes up in virtually all of the epics. The Mahabharata and Ramayana have characters who, well, first of all, are exiled to the forest and spend a good deal of time in the forest, whether it's the Pandavas or Lord Ram and Sita and Lakshman going into the forest. But you also have these characters who are, in a sense, cross between human beings, animals, and deities. And I always find that, to me, is a fascinating part of mythology, because there is something in us, I think, that is, of course, animal. I think we aspire to there being something in us that is divine, whether it's there or not. And that sort of intersection of the divine, the human, and the animal, I think, is a part of so much storytelling. It's there also. I mean, there's a wonderful book called Hay ibn Yaqzan by a medieval Muslim writer from Andalusia, and it's the story of a child who's in a shipwreck. He gets left on an island and is raised by animals, and then is brought back to civilization. So Mowgli isn't where it began. It began much, much earlier. And Kipling sort of caught a hold of that and brought it into the end of into the Victorian era, and then into the early 20th century. But in fact, the interesting thing about when I was writing this book, and I had a Christian missionary who helps rescue this child and then adopts the child in the process of the story, I found the number of biblical references to situations where human beings were either cast out into the wilderness, or who lived for a period of time in the wilderness. It's there throughout Christian and Judaic tradition as well. So it's a very, very potent myth, and I think even today, I think it captures our imagination, and it triggers, as I said, fantasies, but it also triggers enormous anxieties as well, particularly when it comes to our own sense of identity.
Right. I was also wondering if it fed into the whole larger question of nature versus nurture, and whether we suspect that being human is more a cultural thing than anything else.
Right. And I play with that a little bit in the book. I tried to be as subtle as possible because I didn't want it to become a psychology textbook. The the idea of nature versus nature is of course a debate that will never end. But I like to think that in this book there's a little bit of both. The nurture is very much a part of his identity, Daniel's identity in the book. But there's something in him that he remembers, or even if he doesn't remember it as a clear and vivid memory, it's there on a subliminal level, and he recognizes that there's something there in his past that connects to other species, in particular elephants, but also just to that world of the forest, that world of the wild. In that way.
I just loved that section. I didn't want it to end, and it was it just felt like I was jolted out of that magical world when the next section came. Um, would you consider fleshing it out into like a full-fledged novel by itself?
Well, when I said I started working on the book as a children's, not so much a children, but a young adult novel, I started with that section, which basically retells the story of a boy in the forest with the animals, and he's raised by langur monkeys and elephants. And the matriarch of the herd is essentially his mother, or one of his mothers. And but I felt at a certain point that I needed to move away from that. And that was what I was attempting to do, was to sort of make that break, and then go into another world. But I hope at the end of the story, I'm able to at least hint that we go back into that world, um, uh, at least in our imaginations.
Right. The other thing I couldn't help comparing between Jungle Book and your book is that he villainizes Shere Khan. So I was really, I mean, I read it later in life and I was much more aware of how we portray animals and how we characterize them and how these making these villains out of animals can have far reaching consequences in the real world. So, was that something you were conscious of as well? Because here there is a tiger character who's terrifying, but he doesn't develop into that kind of malevolent character. He's more of the hero who saves the day, literally. Is that something you were consciously doing?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that I didn't want the tiger to be the villain, as you put it. That it's very much what happens in Kipling, and Disney, I think, took it even one step further. Uh, and the tiger and the snake become the bad guys, and the monkeys and the bear and the leopard become the good guys. Kipling books themselves don't draw the lines quite as clearly as that. But nevertheless, the Mowgli ultimately kills the tiger in the Jungle Books, and then he dances with its skin. And there's this pretty horrific sequence where he has become the hunter, and then he has flayed the tiger, and he celebrates the death of Shere Khan and all of that. So it's pretty violent and pretty judgmental. And I think this goes really to the fundamental problem that I have with the Kipling stories, is that he gets hung up on this phrase, the law of the jungle. And it's as if, I think I've written elsewhere, that it sort of becomes, it's this sort of, colonial magisterial sort of judgments that are placed on the forest. And Kipling can't seem to get away from the idea that the whole colonial experience is sort of civilizing, bringing law and order to a wild place, which of course is the whole problem with colonial discourse. But when he applies it to the forest, you realize, of course, that it's complete nonsense. If you have spent any time in the forest, there isn't any law of the jungle. Of course, there's all kinds of relationships between species. There are dependencies, there are conflicts, there's all that kind of stuff. But to call it the law of the jungle makes it all seem as if it's been codified and put in those books that lawyers have in their offices, and that somehow if we can understand those books, we can understand the jungle, which isn't the way it works, of course.
Yeah. You mentioned the identity thing, so I just wanted to come back to that and now make a bigger point about it. So we, as humans, we have this innate curiosity about who we are, and now in the modern age, we even have this commercial consumer DNA companies which will tell you where your ancestors came from. In that sense, I was sort of expecting Mowgli or Daniel to go back and find his biological mother, because you did call the book Mowgli and His Mothers, and I felt set up. But he doesn't find his biological mother. Is there a reason for that?
Well, first of all, my publisher suggested the subtitle, so I won't take blame for that. But no, I think I like the subtitle. I like the subtitle only because it introduces an element of ambiguity, the idea that someone could possibly have more than one mother, uh, an adoptive mother, but also a mother that raised him, and then a mother who is his birth mother, or his biological mother in that way. The biological mother, without spoiling the story, I think is the most ambiguous, and is the one that is there and is the biggest question mark for him. And yet he has no information. I think even if he resorted to today's DNA tests, it would probably tell him very little. So he's stuck with this unknown point of origin. And I think that's something that fascinates me. I think, I'm often asked, where are you from? And it's a question that leaves me puzzled. It leaves me sort of grasping for an answer that will, first of all, satisfy the person who's asked that question, but also will somehow dig into my own psyche and try to sort of satisfy myself with an answer that may or may not be true. One of the things I've found over the years is when people ask me that question, where are you from? It's far easier for me to lie and simply say, I'm from Boston, particularly if I'm in the United States. Then the sort of questions stop at that point. But if I say I'm from India, then there's always a follow-up question. And if I try to be honest, then there'll be half a dozen follow-up questions. And I often find myself just avoiding it by not telling the truth. But as far as a character like Daniel, who's the main character in Feral Dreams, he really has a problem in terms of trying to figure out where his origins lie. Because there are all these stories that were told about him and that continue to be told about him, none of which are necessarily reliable or true or provable in any way. So he knows that when Miss Cranston talks about where he came from, or where other people in the compound where he grew up talk about where he came from, that isn't quite true. And then when he himself ends up in the United States and is having to explain himself on many levels, he finds that again he has to, in a sense, fabricate the story of his origins, fabricate the answer to that question, where do you come from?
Right. There's a question here from one of the viewers. What made you think of, I guess I'm filling in words, matriarchal elephants to take over the responsibility of raising Mowgli in your book? The book gave vivid description of elephants.
Well, that's an interesting question, and there's the very simple answer is I love elephants. I've always found that elephants are, particularly elephants in the wild, have a particular social behavioral patterns and things like that fascinate me. The way in which they protect each other, particularly the young. There's something, as I've watched elephants over the years, there's something very appealing about them. And in many ways, there's something very, I hate to say it, but something very human about them. And I mean that in the best sense of that word. But for instance, there's a wonderful Arabic text by a writer named Muhammad Damiri, who was writing back in the 12th century or the 13th century, I forget. But in that, he has a passage where he says, he's describing the tongue of an elephant. And he said the tongue of the elephant, not the trunk, this is the tongue. The tongue in the elephant is upside down. And if it were to be turned right side up, elephants could speak to you and me. And I think it's a wonderful idea. I often think that we should reverse it and say our tongues are upside down, and if we were to reverse them, we would be able to express the silence that elephants express so beautifully. One last thing on that, I could go on and on about elephants. I wrote a book a number of years ago about elephants, a nonfiction book called Elephas Maximus. So it was something that I immersed myself in. But the last thing I'll say in answer to that question is, when I was teaching writing, I used to have two or three very simple rules for my students. And one of those rules was no talking animals. And then when I started writing this book, of course, I was up against a major, major problem. But elephants, if you're at all familiar with them, they make sounds that are so low, they are often beyond the range of our hearing. And people have been able to record those sounds and then amplify them and mix them up and do whatever they do with technology so that we can then hear those sounds. And so in my story, I imagined that this mother elephant would speak to Mowgli, but she's not speaking our language. In fact, it's a sort of subliminal form of communication. So I got around the rule that I'd set for my students, at least partially that way.
That's an interesting answer. So there was someone's taking off from something we discussed earlier, saying, what are some of the cliches of Jungle Book that you wanted to combat in the 21st century sequel to the classic? We talked about villainization of animals. Was there anything else that you did that you felt Kipling could have avoided?
Well, I think there were a number of cliches that come into Kipling's writing. I think that the one, perhaps it's not a cliche, but the one thing that I was fully aware of is that I'm writing this at the beginning of the 21st century, and he was writing his stories at the end of the 19th century and into I forget exactly when it was published, but it's well over 100 years ago. And at that point in time, people looked at the Indian jungle, the forests, as this sort of limitless wild space that was, inhabited by dangerous creatures. And if you wandered into it, you might not be able to get yourself out. That it was so vast and so, tangled that you weren't going to get your way out of it. Now, of course, we know that, and we realize, sadly, that area of forest has shrunk to such a degree that the animals are hemmed in by human settlements, by development, by roads, and so on and so forth. So I wanted to write this book with that in mind, in the sense that Mowgli is not just in a limitless forest, but in fact is living inside a national park or a sanctuary. And so there are limits to the forest, and he tests those limits. If there's anyone who's a villain in the story, it's human poachers who are there. And even the forest guards in the national park are a threat to him as he tries to remain in the wild there. So I was trying to overturn some of the assumptions, perhaps more than stereotypes, that Kipling has in his book.
Okay. Oh, someone's asked what inspired you to write this novel.
Well, I think very, very simply, it was my own reading of the Jungle Book as a child, the Jungle Books as a child, as well as having seen the film at a young age, the Disney film at a young age. But I think also what inspired me was that I think it's very important for younger readers today to have a set of stories that take them into the forest, take them into nature, give them a connection with nature, whether they are in an urban setting or whether they are, living in a town like Missouri as well. I think one of the reasons I started to write the book was to say, for someone who doesn't have a daily experience of the natural world, this might be something that would excite their imagination, would capture their ideas of what the world should be like, and so on and so forth. So I think I was really trying to motivate readers to explore that world beyond the pages of this book.
Okay, I'm just going to step out of the book for a minute. How do we, I mean, in this time of many of our role models um, falling down as a result of Me Too and stuff like that, how do we deal with the problematic aspects of writers' lives? Like Kipling, for instance, defended colonialism very much. So, how do we read his books in this time and age?
Right. Well, I think that Kipling was a proponent of the colonial power in India. He was certainly has a lot of what he writes is outright racist stuff. A lot of his poetry, particularly, is racist doggerel at best. But I think there are elements of his stories which I think, as I hope I've done in this book, I can take and overturn. So rather than simply dismissing Kipling's work and saying it's nonsense, it's racist, it's wrong, um, I prefer to be able to say, okay, I accept all of those judgments, but let me see if there's some way I can overturn it and take it in a different direction, which will then, of course, it becomes a critique of Kipling's politics, his literary vision as well, perhaps, and certainly his time, and yet doesn't simply close the book or burn the book or put it aside in that way. So I'm very much, I think, in this book critiquing his position, both his political position, but also his view of nature in that way. And I hope that that would come across. I'm certainly not writing this book simply to celebrate his legacy. That would be a disaster and is largely impossible.
Right. Mowgli's relationships with his elephant mother and his adopted mother is emotional. How do these relationships impact his life in the book?
Well, the emotions, I think, in both cases are complicated. The emotions that he feels for his elephant mother, the matriarch, I think are much more gentle, much more sensitive in many ways. She is I think an interesting character because she, as an elephant, as a young elephant, was raised in captivity, and so she knows the human world from that experience. And then at a certain point, her mahout let her free, and she joined a wild herd. So Mowgli connects with her on that level because she herself is a creature that moves beyond the forest and then returns to the forest in that way. And so I think there's a much closer attachment there as well. I think one of the things I should say, and I won't go on about elephants, but when I was writing the book about elephants, one thing that struck me was that you cannot really say that an elephant is tamed. An elephant may be trained, an elephant may be kept in captivity, but ultimately many elephants that are kept in captivity return to the wild. There are many instances of forest department elephants just wandering off with the herd, and that's the end of it. So she has that crossover experience that Mowgli himself has. With his adoptive mother, Miss Cranston, the American missionary that takes him in, it's a far more complicated experience, and it's very strong emotions, emotions of love, but also emotions of anger, resentment, as to, you adopted me without even asking whether I wanted to be adopted, which is a fundamental problem for him. And then you ripped me out of this secure world that I had sort of come to know and took me off to America. And it was even more disturbing and ultimately there's a rift in their relationship because of that. So the emotions with Miss Cranston, his human mother, are far more complicated and fraught with tension. With the maternal, with the matriarch and her maternal instincts towards him, I think it's a much closer and affectionate relationship.
That's actually interesting. So there's another layer of identity crisis in the book where he doesn't know he's a human, and he gets told by all these different creatures that he's human, and he doesn't like that idea. But then he compares himself to other human beings. I like that. I mean, so this whole question of identity works at so many different levels.
Mm.
That's really nice. Okay, here's another question. How's your lifetime's research on the Himalaya informed this unique novel?
Um, Not much, to be honest, in the sense that I consciously chose. I'd been writing about the Himalaya for years, and I thought to myself, I'm going to write a book that isn't set in the Himalaya, just because my attention span had sort of shifted, at least temporarily. Um, the interesting thing is that I set it in what is sometimes referred to as Rohilkhand, a part of Uttar Pradesh, near Bareilly and Pilibhit, in that area near the Nepal border. Um, Interestingly enough, ultimately there is one scene where they do go up to Nainital, so I couldn't quite escape the mountains in that way. But no, this book, I wanted very much to write a story that was set on the plains and in the forests, the lowland forests of India, because that's where Kipling's book is set, and that's quite a different world from the Himalayan forests that I've written about elsewhere.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a completely off the wall question. You don't have to answer it. But there are so many movies now about Jungle Book. There was one that came out recently, a year or so ago. If someone were to make a movie based on your book, who do you see playing Mowgli?
That's an interesting question. Yeah, obviously Daniel comes from India, so the actor would very likely be someone in India, perhaps in Bollywood. I don't know. I mean, if I was to pick an actor, I mean, sadly he's departed, but Irfan Khan would have been a wonderful uh, actor to take on a role like that. But I think there are many other actors. The problem fundamentally would be that there's Daniel at different ages,
Hmm.
and if someone were to make a film out of this book, they would have to decide at what. The nice thing about being a novelist is you don't have to worry about your actors' ages. You can just carry on and tell your story. Whereas when you're making a film, you've got to have continuity, you've got to have makeup and all that kind of thing. So it could, I mean, if the person who made it into a film focused purely on Daniel as a young boy, and the character Mowgli, who isn't Daniel, but it's Miss Cranston's imagination of what Daniel might have been. You could uh, choose a child actor who was unknown, and I think that would probably be an interesting choice.
Yeah.
But
Sorry.
nope, that's fine.
I wanted to talk about nature writing in India as well. And, someone was telling me there isn't enough nature writing in India. What, how do you consider nature writing in India? Is it the more prosaic um, profiling of parks or ecological work, or would you consider what you got here in this book and the first part of the book? Would that make nature writing as well?
Well, I think one of the encouraging things is that there are an awful lot of younger writers who are focusing on nature, and all you have to do is look at um, magazines like Sanctuary Asia or Save Us, or even the Sunday supplements carry articles about wildlife or the mountains or whatever it might be that are written by younger writers who are exploring and discovering the magic of those particular environments, the magic of those particular species. And it's wonderful that many people are turning to that as a subject matter for their writing. I think in many cases, what you're getting often is what I refer to often as reportage, rather than reflective writing, in the sense that somebody will say, I went to Bandhavgarh and I saw 3 tigers, and one of the tigers happened to be lying next to a pond, and a bird landed on its shoulder. And so you're told a story about whatever was observed within that particular environment. And that's fine. That kind of writing is interesting. It's often accompanied by photographs, and those photographs illustrate that story. And one thing I can say in India is that there are a vast number of nature photographers. I have joked about it often in the sense that when you go into the forest now in any of the national parks, you take your life into your hands, because everybody is armed with these cameras that look like bazookas. And the minute a tiger appears, everybody is swinging their lenses around trying to get a shot. And I've been hit on the head many times by these wretched lenses that are look absolutely lethal, and they are. But I'm digressing. I think you had asked about nature writing, and I think I started that with a reason, is that there is an awful lot of writing that just simply describes experiences in the forest in a very journalistic sort of way, and that's perfectly all right. What I think there's still a lot of room for is writers who reflect on nature, and then reflect on the stories that we find in nature, and search for that lyrical, poetic quality that is there in the relationships between species, in the landscapes that we all encounter and love so much. The writer that I often point to is the writer M. Krishnan, who was writing when I was growing up in the 60s and 70s. And he published short pieces in the Illustrated Weekly and other newspapers, often accompanied by his own black and white photographs. And Krishnan was able to tell a story about his experiences in a wonderfully evocative manner and in a really poetic way. And you can really enter into that experience as you read his accounts. My favorite account is he's in the Nilgiris, and he's with a tracker who has taken him to try and see a bear. And they go up the hill and they see this sloth bear above them. And the sloth bear is digging into an anthill or something. And then when it notices that they are there, it looks between its legs and stares down at them before it runs off. And he ends the story with the tracker asking a question, which is, do you think for the bear we were upside down or right side up? And when you have a question like that, and you've been told this story, I still puzzle over it. I think about it so often. If a bear was to look at me upside down between his legs, would I appear upside down or would I be right side up? It's a wonderful way of punctuating that story. And M. Krishnan, he had this sense of humor that comes across in his writing. Salim Ali also, I mean, in many of his descriptions of birds, even in his field guides, there's all sorts of wonderful little touches that are poetic and humorous. And I think that that's something that young writers in India who are writing about nature should strive for, is to somehow go beyond just the superficial descriptions and get to the heart of that story. And your books go in that direction very definitely. For the stories that I've read from my husband and other animals and all, you're looking at the species, you're wanting to get it right, tell us facts and things like that. But there's always an anecdote at the heart of it. There's something that catches your imagination. And I think that's the kind of writing that really needs to be cultivated and encouraged.
Thank you. You've written 13 books of fiction and 7 of nonfiction. Do you have a preference for one or the other?
Gosh, I've lost count, and I should stop counting those books, because some of them I would want to destroy and never look at again. But no, I like going back and forth between fiction and nonfiction, and I tend to do that now. If I've worked on a nonfiction book which has involved a lot of travel and research, it's a huge relief to then set that aside and simply have my laptop screen in front of me, and I'm making it all up. That doesn't mean I don't do research for fiction, but I don't begin with the research. I don't begin with the journeys. I begin with a little bit of memory, a little bit of imagination, and then I mix those together, and that really then becomes the germ of a fictional story. And it's often a huge relief to be able to say, "Wow, I'm not going to have to, hitch a ride on a truck in the middle of Kashmir, at least not for the next 6 months, or spend nights in a tent getting soaking wet, and so on and so forth." So yeah, but then there's also a restlessness I find at a certain point where I want to get out there and walk somewhere and find the story with my feet.
How long did this book take you to write?
This one didn't take that long. I usually think of a book taking about a year or so. This one, I think, was about 9 months in the writing, and then once my publisher and editor got a hold of it, it took another month or so to revise and cut sections and tighten it up and do all of that. So I mean, the whole process ultimately ends up taking a year anyway. I've had books that have taken 5 years as well, but those are primarily nonfiction books that involve a lot of travel and a research. Whereas for a novel, I get bored after a year. I have to start something else. I don't, I know I have friends who spend years on a novel, and then they sort of squeeze it out and don't want to let it go. I'm always quite happy to send it off to the publisher and then make the revisions and then move on.
Is there anything else you wanted to say about the book that I might have missed asking?
No, not. I can't think of anything specific. I think that one of a recent reviewer sort of picked up on the book and said that it was very critical of missionaries, and the fact that the Miss Cranston, who's the other one of the two main characters, is very much trying to convert this child that is found in the forest and so on and so forth. I hope that most readers wouldn't take away from that. I mean, I'm in other books I've been very critical of the missionary project and the whole idea of conversion and all of that. So it's not something I condone or advocate in any way, shape, or form. But I think in this book, it's a much more subtle situation and a much more she, as a single woman, has taken this child in and decides to adopt him. And it's not so much that she wants to make him a Christian or whatever her intentions might be. She genuinely wants to make him her son. And of course, she comes from a Christian background and all of that. That's part of it. But I didn't see the book necessarily being a direct critique of missionary activities in that way.
Yeah, it wasn't. It had a very soft. In fact, it was a nice way of portraying religion with all its plurality. Excuse me. And especially in the world where we are so polarized about it now. So it was I thought it was, you played it very well. It was very nicely done.
Yeah, I'll just briefly add that I had written a section that I cut out of the book, which played with the idea of the child brought out of the forest, and I mentioned the book Khaib and Yaksan about this child that's shipwrecked and then brought to the city. And one of the fundamental questions that the philosophers who encounter this child want to ask him is, was he aware of God, having been raised by animals? And I think I mean, it's an intriguing question, and it clearly fascinated the author of Hayib and Yaksan, and I think it is an intriguing idea. I myself would reject the idea. I don't think that is particularly important, uh, given the circumstances of Daniel's birth and all of that. But nevertheless, it is something that I think does capture our imagination. And it's an interesting question to ask yourself, particularly if you are a person of faith. If there was a child who grew up until the age of 12 or 15 in the forest and then was brought into civilization, what would he make of the word God and the whole concept of God? It's an interesting puzzle.
And on that note, we will leave it there. Thank you so much, Steve, for talking to us.
Thank you, Janaki, very much. And thanks to all the people who wrote comments. I'm sorry we couldn't answer all of your questions, but I appreciate them very much. Thank you.